Good evening, everyone, and very, very warm welcome to this Family Learning Series event brought to you by this outstanding Wellness Center team and special guest. We have a very amazing and distinguished panel of speakers tonight where we're going to be considering the topic of social anxiety in teens, and are very, very glad that you're here. My name is Jim Cartnal, and I'm your high school principal, and I am the lucky colleague to be working with three outstanding individuals who staff our wellness center, brand new to the campus, and also just delighted to welcome a very, very special guest to us with a warm Spartan welcome, Dr. Tracy Gallardo. I'm going to provide an opportunity for each of my colleagues and our presenters, panelists tonight to introduce themselves. Did want to let you know that we are recording this for the first part of Dr. Ballardo's remarks, and then we are considering shutting that down so that the Q&A is not going to be something that will be recorded. I would like to also speak to right now directly about the 60 or 70 some attendees. If you would wish to direct any questions towards the panelists, you'll use the Q&A feature down below to do so, and we'll be monitoring that across the evening. Ms. Zoe, would you mind?
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I am Rachel Zoe. I'm now the Wellness Center counselor and have been lucky to be involved in the planning and then the opening last year of the Wellness Center and our new services and programs. I'm excited to be here tonight in our virtual setting, and thank you for attending. Can I introduce to you Dr. Erica Smith from, who we contracted with, if you don't know her, from Sage Therapy, Sage, well, it's called Sage, School-Based Mental Health Services. Erica?
Good evening. Oh, sorry.
Oh.
Good evening, everybody. Sorry, I'm new on Zoom. My name is Erica Smith, and I am the therapist that works at the Wellness Center. So that's basically my job. I am like the most lucky person in the world to talk to kids all day. And we're so lucky. I'm so excited to have Dr. Tracy Gallardo with us and to work with these lovely ladies and with James Cartnal. I just love my job. So if you have any questions for me, you can find my contact information on the website as well.
Beth, do you want to take a moment and introduce yourself real quick?
Certainly. Hi, everybody. I'm Beth Mumbright. I'm the office worker in the Wellness Center. Get to work with Rachel and Erica and Mr. Cartnal as well. Awesome job. I will not give it up for anything, so they're stuck with me for life. It's great to be on campus with the students, with the amazing administration that is so supportive of the Wellness Center to be a service to the great kids on campus. Lackawanna is a great place to be, and I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm excited to hear what Tracy Gallardo has to say tonight.
So thank you very much, Wellness Center team. So for folks that have just come in, that are our attendees, we're delighted that you're here. We're going to ask you to put your questions in the Q&A, use that function, and we'll be monitoring that. The program that we've established is roughly the first half is a direct presentation, then we've left the kind of last half to respond to questions. We're delighted to have Tracy Gallardo, and we welcome her to La Cañada with all of the good things that Spartan Nation would send to you. And again, gratitude for you being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'll go ahead and set our talk to record. And if I can have some help just reminding me to take us off recording once we get to the Q&A. Just a little bit about me. I'm actually a psychologist. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work primarily with kids and teens That puppet back, or that B back there, is a puppet to stand for Dr. B. It's kind of a nice, kind of fun, friendly way to introduce therapy to kids. And I just love having it be my little mascot. So there it is. I'm actually a college instructor too. And so right now everything is through Zoom. And so it's actually pretty familiar to me to record. And then I also, when my students have a Q&A at the end, I take us off recording just to actually account for social anxiety of all things, as well as just having general privacy. So I'm very delighted to be here tonight with you all. One thing I like to explain when we're talking about social anxiety is really just using a framework to look at this with students, with parents that I work with that, are sending their kids to therapy to work with me, as well as college students that I treat in therapy. So when it comes to social anxiety, what I like to really kind of introduce to people is this big kind of fancy long word, what we call the biopsychosocial model. So the biopsychosocial model really stands for the fact that we can kind of study anything in psychology, such as social anxiety in this case, from a biological lens, a psychological lens, and then a social or sociocultural lens. So I'm going to kind of just walk us through that and then kind of hopefully set a framework for you of what social psychology is, and then take us into the Q&A, of course. So if there's questions that come up, please feel free. Don't be shy to ask whatever comes to mind. I know this can be really interesting and I get really passionate about it and can get very talkative. So please ask any questions that maybe I've missed or that just spark your interest. So defining social anxiety, I think we all kind of know, it's kind of a common kind of buzzword at this point. But just kind of spelling it out, social anxiety really is this fear of social judgment. So we all can be susceptible to social anxiety at any age, although we do know, looking at the stats, adolescents are the most at risk for developing social anxiety. And we'll talk about why today. But in a nutshell, it really is just this fear of social judgment, as well as a fear of scrutiny. So fear of being criticized by others. And that could be because the teen in this case has actually had that happen with a particular individual, or they're just really afraid that may happen. And it's more of that future fantasy, this negative fantasy that this may happen to them. So for some, it can be performance-based, such as public speaking. And for others, it's not performance-based at all. And it could be something like having a strong aversion to eating in front of people, for example. So I just want to have you have that in the back of your head. As we go along tonight, just thinking about your teens, if you've ever had experiences where you notice that they didn't want to go to school and you kind of, scratched below the surface and you realize, well, maybe that day it was because they had a presentation, but then it turned into more than just that. Or maybe you felt, I don't think there's anxiety there, but for some reason they just really have opposition on, to go to school on Fridays or whatnot. So just think about encounters you've had as a parent, and think about, maybe noticing that when your child came home from school, you packed a lunch for them or they packed their lunch and they're bringing it home. What does this mean? It could be indications of other things, but I do want to give you kind of some of the unique sort of symptoms, if you will, of social anxiety, because it's not just that shy, timid child or shy adult even with social anxiety. It can really kind of present itself in different ways. Other sort of factors that play a role with social anxiety are, we all have experienced it, going up in front of a class and doing a public talk, or maybe even in your own professional careers, doing some sort of public speaking engagement and feeling hot and flushed and sweaty, nervous, maybe even just being worried about the language you're going to use. These can be some of the physiological symptoms that we see with social anxiety. And again, it doesn't have to be that the person is in front of a crowd doing some sort of public speaking to have some of those symptoms. So it could be things that you see, or it could be things that you don't see, such as the person with social anxiety having a increased heart rate. So those are some of the signs of what social anxiety might look like. I spoke a moment ago about some of the prevalence rates. So we do see that people that are in adolescence as well as adulthood, that's when they can start to present with social anxiety, as well as teen girls in particular. So we'll talk a little bit about that too when I go through that biopsychosocial model. So starting us off, biological factors. One thing I really wanted to introduce, and I think this is a big takeaway for parents, is during our teen years, this is really when the brain is still under construction. So I'll get into a little bit of brain anatomy. But for those of you who have young drivers at home, just think about your car insurance bill, right? So we all know that when someone's under 25, the car insurance is going to be much higher than when they're over 25. So you may, kind of be upset with AAA or whoever your insurance provider is, but there is actually some science behind this. And that's because our brains actually aren't fully developed until plus or minus around age 25. So with that being said, I want you to just kind of have that in the back burner and think about, okay, why is my teen possibly moody today or particularly anxious? I had this logical, almost young adult seeming person in the car ride home with me. And then now I just have this anxious situation at home. What is this about? So let's go through the brain a little bit. For those of you who are interested in this, I'm going to use, Dan Siegel's an neuropsychologist in the field. He's very famous, wonderful doctor, in the field that studies neuroscience, and he loves talking about what I'm talking about here with using your hands. So those of you at home, we're all at home, right? Take out your hand or both if you want. And what I want you to do is put your thumb down and then put all 4 fingers down and just kind of move your hand like this. This is how Dan Siegel kind of presents what's happening in the brain. So when we're babies, even before we're born, the brainstem and the bottom part of the brain is the first to develop. And throughout our young adult lives, this full part of the brain is still developing. So this front part up here is called the prefrontal cortex. And this is what houses what is nicknamed to be the boss of the brain, if you will. And I'm going to put my hand down because it's actually distracting me a little bit. I talk a lot with my hands. So I'm going to put my hand down. You can keep your hand up if you want, and we'll go back to our handy model. But that front part of the brain is this last part to develop. And this is what's responsible for executive functioning. So, really just allowing us to plan, to make decisions, to realize that, maybe we're feeling irritable, but maybe that's because we didn't eat that day, or maybe that's because, someone really, upset us, and we're able to kind of regulate that emotion thanks to the front of the brain and kind of move on. Well, in our teen years, as you recall, the front part of the brain is the last to develop. So we develop from kind of the bottom up. So if you look back at your thumb, so we can go back to our handy model, this thumb is representing the kind of like the emotional housing of the brain. So the limbic system is responsible for controlling and managing our emotions. And one thing that happens when we get excited or nervous or scared, in particular, is that our amygdala, which is part of this limbic system, really kind of fires. And with teens, this is actually pretty mature. It's actually pretty fully developed, but the prefrontal cortex isn't. So the prefrontal cortex, the boss of the brain, is usually able to kind of manage and, kind of be the CEO telling the amygdala, okay, calm down, it's a false alarm. No one's just hacking you. Relax, eat a sandwich, you'll feel better. Teens really aren't able to regulate themselves in that way because, again, the brain is still under construction. So as parents, that's where you all come in. As educators, as adults working with children, we get to be the quote-unquote boss of the brain and kind of help them co-regulate and help them really just take perspectives. Another thing happening during this brain, or I should say actually this development, in teens is teens have a really, really hard time taking perspectives of others. So you've probably seen it. We all have been teenagers, right? So we all can think back to our own times of having a difficult time taking perspective. This is actually really developmentally appropriate, and psychologists call this egocentricity. So it's actually not saying that teenagers are selfish and are going to grow up to have no empathy and only think about themselves. It's actually there's science in this, again, with the growing, developing brain, that this is the time of our lives. This is the time for your teens' lives to be really kind of centered and focused on what's going on with them. So having said all that, where does social anxiety fall into place? Well, we have an overfiring amygdala, basically telling us that, the house is on fire, when in fact, really the toaster just burnt some toast, right? There's a catastrophe going on because the amygdala is not being regulated by the boss of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is still developing. And teens in turn are having a hard time really kind of fighting this amygdala and kind of calming it down, because the prefrontal cortex, again, is still kind of under construction. So we don't really have that mediator there. We don't have that logical part of the brain, in other words, lit up. And instead, we just kind of have that emotional part of the brain lit up. So that's happening during our teens' development. And then we also know that egocentricity is playing a large role in regards to how teens think. And so it could be really age-typical for a teenager to really not understand anyone's perspective other than their own, but it's truly age-typical. So this is what we want to help teens with. So with social anxiety, I really like to explain this and this whole idea of egocentricity as, your teen wakes up, they perceive that they have this giant pimple on their forehead, and you tell them, okay, it's time to go to school. Let's go. Like, I'm going to be late to work. Come on, get in the car. And they just refuse to go. And maybe they don't even mention the pimple. You don't know what's going on just yet. So the two of you go back and forth. Maybe you end up getting into an argument, and they explain to you that they have this pimple and that everyone's going to laugh at them, and they think it's absurd that you're making them go to school. Perspective taking can come into play with maybe taking a playful approach and just maybe even remembering your own time, when you were a teenager and sharing this story with your child of a moment that you felt embarrassed or you were worried of being embarrassed, and you also didn't want to go and do that kind of scary thing like go to school. Chances are, your teen is feeling like they have this giant spotlight on them, when in reality, when they get to school, other people aren't going to likely notice that pimple because they're thinking about their own pimples and looking at their own worries, right? So that's where we can kind of come into play with perspective taking, really just allowing your teen to realize that, yes, this sucks. I see that there's a pimple on your face. We still have to go to school. What do you think other people are going to be worried about today? Just to kind of take a humorous approach, but to also offer them this perspective that as their peers are also developing, likely they are less interested about them, right? I think Eleanor Roosevelt actually has a quote about this, that we would be less worried about what we were doing and what people were thinking about ourselves if we realized how little they were actually paying attention to us. So really just allowing your teen to just kind of normalize it, that this is normal to kind of get embarrassed from time to time, or to worry about being embarrassed, when in reality, it's actually kind of a lower risk than we feel it is. So that's a little bit about the biology of the brain. I wanted to go in next to psychological factors. So with psychological factors, in general, we're looking at things like personality type, temperament, maybe other psychological experiences. But in the case of social anxiety, we see people that have more of what we call behavioral inhibition. So that is kind of the classic shyness with kids or with adults that have social anxiety, that may put them more at risk for thinking that, being in a crowd or being in a public space is going to put them more at risk for being scrutinized or being embarrassed. This could, again, be because they actually did experience bullying, or they're afraid of being bullied, or maybe they saw someone being bullied and they don't want that to be their experience as well. So behavioral inhibition, or, just kind of classically looking at this as shyness, is one factor. And another psychological factor is being a learned behavior. So it could be that they're really worried about being put down on the playground, or, in the case of a high school student, in the lunchroom or on the Zoom call, because they saw it happen to another peer. Or maybe they were bullied back in third grade and they're afraid of this happening again. So instead they avoid interactions with peers, or maybe they even avoid emailing the teacher or whatnot because they're afraid that they're going to be criticized. So again, just to kind of wrap up some psychological factors, we're looking at someone being really behaviorally inhibited, as well as learning that maybe there is some perceived kind of unsafety when it comes to being in a social setting. So we really want to be helping our teens look at ways to kind of work through that. Essentially, what we're seeing a lot of is avoidance. You probably heard it and picked up on it with the pimple example. And if we're thinking about teens that are avoiding emailing their professor or the principal or whoever they need to contact, as well as emailing peers, we want to help them by first kind of acknowledging for ourselves that this may be happening and looking at some of these other warning signs. Is it social anxiety? Is it maybe anxiety around other settings? Could the child be depressed? What's kind of at the bottom of this? Okay, so at the end of this presentation, when we get into the Q&A, I could talk a little bit more about how we can work through avoidance. So we talked about the biological factors, we talked about psychological factors, and now I want to get into social and cultural factors. So I mentioned earlier that females are more at risk for social anxiety. We do see them, teen girls in particular are more at risk, and we see them more statistically predominantly having social anxiety compared to their male peers. So when we look at the research behind this, we do want to take note of more of what's happening socially as opposed to biologically. So if it was more biological, we would say that fundamentally teen boys and teen girls have brains that are just completely different. When we see some differences, but not substantial differences, where we're going to say that this is what's going to evoke social anxiety. So then, as psychologists, we ask ourselves, okay, well, what is it? What's happening? Why are females more susceptible to this? And one thing I like to let parents know is that gender norms play a huge role in this. And so gender norms really are looking at, how do we expect boys to behave? How do we expect girls to behave? How do we expect men to behave? How do we expect women to behave? So with looking at boys, there's actually a whole lot of research on this in regards to education and how teachers of all sorts of education status, including teachers that have the highest level of education, are actually really prone to give boys more attention than girls. And this could be through positive attention of praising boys more than girls, as well as even criticizing boys more than girls. And that gives boys attention, right? And so this is nothing, against the educational system, of course, but looking at the society that we live and breathe in, right? As parents, as educators, as clinicians, as mom and dad, we all kind of come in with this implicit bias of how boys should behave and how girls, quote unquote, should behave. So where does social anxiety come in? Girls are a little bit more, discouraged from raising their hand or taking assertiveness in the classroom, or maybe even with peers, versus boys are a little bit more encouraged or discouraged. And this can kind of happen covertly or overtly. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you are actively saying, put your hand down or whatnot. But girls are kind of picking up on this the moment they are socialized. So that is absolutely gender norm we do want to be paying attention to. And one other kind of social, cultural factor that I like to talk about is social dominance. So if we look at the animal kingdom, we see that there's a hierarchy, right? And this plays a role for survival, where we have predators, preying on smaller animals. And this allows for a power status and power differential, right? So from an evolutionary psychology perspective, people that are kind of in the in-group versus people that are in the out-group kind of play a role in our society. And teens, watch any sort of movie talking about teens, you will see this highlighted, right? Whether it's Mean Girls or Breakfast Club, 16 Candles, you name it, you see these social dynamics at play. And so one thing I like to talk about with teens, whether I'm treating a teen in therapy or working with a parent that doesn't really understand what's going on in regards to social anxiety, is really just taking a step back and looking at that time when you were a teen, maybe you were shy, or maybe you were the queen bee and you played, more of a dominant role. Does that mean you were bullied? No, not necessarily, right? But we are looking again at like how normal it is that these social dynamics are part of our world when we grew up, as well as currently at play with our teens. And so this is such a developmentally appropriate time for children, and in particular teens and adolescents, to explore their identities. And sometimes this can, come with some shyness and really just people with social anxiety just feeling a bit more inhibited, especially with knowing that maybe they perceive that they're part of an out group, and they perceive that they're not able to kind of join that in group. And again, some of this is just around perception and fear, and some of it might be related to their peers, criticizing them or bullying them. So we want to be looking at this from both lenses. So one kind of fun thing I do recommend for parents to do is watch one of these movies with your kid, especially if you suspect that they are not wanting to hop on that Zoom call because they're afraid of turning that camera on, or they're presenting with maybe some opposition, if you will, about going to school when we do go back to face one day. Really just looking at kind of watching this with them and asking them questions about, okay, if you were a character in this movie, who would you play? Asking your teen that, and then maybe asking them guess who you would play as mom or dad. Have some fun with it. And basically what you're doing is really kind of looking at social order and social norms. One real fun thing too is to kind of play an old 80s movie and just show them like, see, this stuff wasn't invented, the year you're going to school. We all kind of went through this. And again, it's not to normalize bullying or to normalize, inappropriate queen bee behavior, if you will, or casting someone as being a part of the out group, but really just looking at this being a time where it can be kind of scary and complicated to figure out who your friends are, how to trust people, how do you explore your identity in a way that feels right and authentic to you. So that's definitely one fun way I like to introduce that to parents. And I love doing it in session with teens, really just really explaining like what does social dynamics mean. I usually get a lot of buy-in when I talk to their teen about how we all behave differently one-on-one compared to how we behave differently in a group. Right? Someone might be bullying you in a group, but then be really nice to you one-on-one, or maybe even vice versa. And so that allows the teen that I'm working with to take some perspective and realize that maybe the bullying, for example, isn't about them. Maybe it's about what's going on for that other person. You could do some really kind of fun work, just talking about masks as well, that we all can kind of have our own defenses, and that can protect people from social anxiety, even if they're the bully, even if they're the queen bee, and your child perceives that they're totally confident when, in reality, it could just be a mask protecting them from maybe being bullied themselves. So I really encourage inviting this sort of conversation. So I think this is probably a really good time to kind of pause and stop the recording. I'm cueing myself to do that right now, and take some questions from everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.
Dr. Tracy Gallardo, thank you. Just thank you. To my fellow panelists, our team in the Wellness Center, wanted to give you an opportunity for final remarks. And again, thank all of our attendees, students and parents and community members. So I'll open it up to the group for any final closing remarks.
Sorry, I was typing responses. Thank you so much for joining us. And I know I wasn't able to get to everybody's questions. I'll stay on a little bit and try. There's certain things that are very specific that I don't feel comfortable totally answering, but I'll do my best. But we're, of course, the Wellness Center is always open to consult at wellnesscenter@lcusd.net is our email address, or you can find all of our information on the homepage of the website. There's a virtual wellness center and all of our contact information is there. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Great questions.
So
Thank
we
you. I
wanted to-
absolutely enjoyed. Yeah, sorry. I just want to say I enjoyed answering them and hearing from you all. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we wanted to wish everyone a very good night. Hope you and yours remain safe in these, trying times. I wanted just to reflect as something that Tracy said a minute ago, and to all of those that were, wondering about Zoom. I've heard from any number of our students who have spoken about the difficulties having cameras on, and and there's a lot of reasons for that. So for parents and students where that is a struggle, I would ask you just be honest with one another and chat a little bit about it. Also note the tip that you have the ability to turn your own image off in this tiled universe that we're now standing in. When I've told that to a couple of kids, they have been remarkably surprised, and that's made it easier so they didn't have to look at themselves for so many, class periods of a day. Not suggesting that's a fix-all for everyone's, but we're doing all the very best things we can, like hosting events of this kind and keeping together as a school community. Students going to office hours, parents encouraging their students to go into office hours, students working hard at their studies and doing their very best to know that what we are all working in and living in during these time of pandemics is remarkably challenging, and that together, without sounding silly about it, but together we'll get through this as a campus community, as a learning community, as a school community, and as a wonderful town like Flint Ridge. Thank you to everyone for coming tonight. We wish you well. Be safe. Talk soon. Bye.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.